All right, I think our numbers have stabilized, so we will go ahead and get started. And thank you, everybody, for being here. A big thank you, especially to Jessica and UA. So this is an online seminar provided by the Center on Aging, Climate, and Health, or soon to be renamed the Center on Aging, Health, and the Environment. But CACHE, CACHE is our acronym. We're a virtual research center. Many of you probably already know about the center. That's why you're here. But our entire goal is to facilitate work on the interdisciplinary connection between aging, climate, and health. We offer lots of different sorts of online resources, seminars like this that give you some great insight on how to do this work. On the website, you'll find other kinds of training materials. You'll find code. You'll find pointers to different data that might be of use to you as you work on the connection between aging, climate, and health. But today we're going to hear from Dr. Jessica Finley. Her presentation is called Hazardous Homes and Communities, a mixed method study of disaster exposure and dementia risk. I'll introduce Jessica, but let me also just say, please go ahead and put questions into the chat as her presentation unfolds, just so you don't forget them. But we'll use those as a jumping off point for the last 15, 20 minutes of our time together to spur Q&A. So don't hesitate to go ahead and put your comments and questions in the chat, but we'll probably wait towards the end to get to them unless they're necessary for clarification. So Dr. Jessica Finley is an assistant professor of geography and a fellow in the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. I have the great privilege of calling her a colleague, so thank you, Jessica, for being here. She's a health geographer and environmental gerontologist with research that explores how built social and natural environments shape health and well-being, with a focus on aging in place, cognitive health disparities, and the impacts of hazards like COVID-19 and wildfires. Jessica's NIH and NSF funded research has earned national recognition, including multiple Rising Star Awards. So we're very pleased that she's here to share her expertise and insights. So, Jessica, I will hand it to you.
Thank you, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here today. Oh, wait, I shared the wrong screen. Give me 1 second. Um, I love the beeps of everyone's coming in. And I'll actually also be presenting with Dr. Yue Sun today. Yue is a postdoc with me at the University of Colorado Boulder, also in the Institute of Behavioral Science. Let me just get my slides to start. There we go. And Yue holds a PhD in sociology. She studies population health, geographic disparities, the environment, natural resources, really seeking to understand how political economy overlaps and informs and gets under our bodies and our skin to really think through geographic disparities in health and mortality. And so today we're going to present on some of our mixed methods work. The plan is that I will briefly introduce myself and cognitability and how we came to this research. As always, it's a bit of a story and a path of who we are and where we live and who we engage with. I will then cover a qualitative study, the Marshall Fire Community Health Project, and then UA will take over and cover some of the quantitative setup that we are undertaking right now in the health and retirement study. So just a little bit more about me to set the background of how and why we've come to this work. I am a health geographer and environmental gerontologist, interested in where people live as they age and how it affects their health and well-being. I blend together approaches from geography, gerontology, and public health, and use mixed methods research. So trying to gain both in-depth, rich, and nuanced qualitative findings that can then inform and connect with quantitative findings in broader, often national data sets. So my journey began when I moved to the States. I moved from Canada to Minneapolis to become involved in the geography program there to do a master's and PhD. And I became really interested in experiences of aging in place, what older adults feel they need to support them in their homes and environments. And so I interviewed 125 aging adults across the Minneapolis metropolitan area about their experiences and how overlapping built, social, and natural environmental factors impact their health and well-being, with a particular focus on underserved individuals. So folks who were low income, racially, ethnically marginalized, as well as housing insecure. And I was a geographer expecting to study, classic environmental aspects. And something that surprised me that came up was widespread fears of cognitive decline, a very relatable fear of losing yourself and your independence, um, your identity. People would say, well, I roughly know how to navigate mobility impairments. I could, put a chair in the shower, or I can install a grab bar, or ask family or friends for a ride. Well, what if I do if I start to wander? Or if I leave the stove unattended and cause a house fire. Dementia and Alzheimer's represented huge unknowns and huge fears and huge cost considerations, worries about needing very expensive care, and being a burden on family and friends and broader community networks. So that led me to really think through, what do we know about environmental risk factors for cognitive health and dementia more specifically? This was the current kind of research at the time. I will update this later in the talk, but at the time when I was starting my postdoc at Michigan, um, there's kind of at the there's we could theoretically prevent or delay 40% of dementia cases worldwide by intervening upon risk factors in early life, midlife, and later life. So you'll see, of course, as a geographer, I think through, well, how do environments structure these risk factors? Now, air pollution is the most robust and expansive area of kind of classic biological hazardous exposures, and we have seen repeated risk factors, and links to, for example, if you live near a large highway and polluting roadways, we are seeing studies come out about exposure to multiple smoke days, and so we know air pollution is kind of our mainstay focus, but I wanted to think beyond that. I'm more of a social and behavioral researcher. So for me, I think about, well, how do environments structure, your risk for being socially isolated or physically active, or what you eat or who you see. And so that was where kind of I wanted to focus my research, in addition to complement the kind of classic biological and hazards perspective. So I was inspired by walkability because it blends together geography and urban planning and public health. So I made up a term called cognability. Thankfully, 6, 7 years later, my phone no longer wants to correct the typo. And I really wanted to think through how environments matter for cognitive health, primarily through social and behavioral pathways. So, how can your neighborhood or environment encourage you to be physically active, socially engaged, cognitively stimulated, and not overexposed to hazards? All of these are protective for your brain, but they're also linked to a quality of life, right? The ability to get out the door, be active, and feel connected with others. So we had a series of papers that used qualitative work to inspire hypotheses that we then tested in a large national aging sample. I won't go into depth on that today because that's not the focus of this talk, but I just wanted to set the stage of this kind of framing and perspective we take to this work. So we found, for example, that having access to recreation centers, civic and social organizations, and performing arts museums had a significant and positive link with cognitive health, in a large study of aging Black and white Americans across the entire United States. Highways, of course, not unsurprising, were negative, as well as fast food. And so this was kind of the framing that brought me into the next stage of my career. So I was beyond excited to get a job at the University of Colorado Boulder. I had family here. It was closer to my own family back home. Just a wonderful place to live. And so a few years ago now, this is where I moved to. And for the first time in my life, fires really became an ever-present conversation and consideration. I've only usually lived in wet places and cold places, and now I'm somewhere dry. And my kids, for example, I put my older two on the slide. They didn't live here for the Marshall Fire, which we'll cover today, but they are stressed on windy days. They've already picked up on some of the collective trauma that those are our high risk fire days. And we talk about that. When we bike or go to school, for example. In the bottom left, that's a photo from one of my family members out in British Columbia, out near Vancouver, where we now have regular heavy smoke, and wildfires in our region. So it's not just affecting, my current home, but it's affecting many of the homes I've had even across my life course, which isn't that long in the scheme of things as an aging scholar. So it's something that was on my mind, and I wanted to think through in new and different ways with the opportunity of being at CU Boulder. And so today we're going to talk about the Marshall Fire. This was a destructive wildland urban interface fire. So this was something that happened on kind of the urban fringe, and it affected communities of Superior and Louisville across Boulder County on December 30th of 2021. More than 1,000 homes and commercial buildings burned, and many, many others were smoke damaged. And unlike kind of classic wildfires, we don't fully understand yet the health impacts of a WUI fire, as we call them, the wildland urban interface, because they're burning mostly human made materials. So it's not kind of your classic vegetation brush that's getting burned, but it also includes things like cars and houses, and buildings. And so these are releasing a lot of hazardous substances like VOCs and PM 2.5, and other PAHs. So many, many substances are getting released in these fires, and we need to think through them in many evolving and different ways. And I am fortunate also at CU Boulder to work with Dr. Colleen Reed. She's a geographer. She's also the Institute of Behavioral Science and really a leading expert in wildfires and kind of these contexts of climate change, and increasing extreme events. And Colleen and many others at CU have been involved in quantitative studies that have been following folks since the fire. So we sent out a large survey to everyone we could find and reach, and we're quantitatively assessing how folks are doing, how they were impacted, and their kind of physical, mental health, and other multifaceted aspects since the fire. But quantitative research can only cover so much. We often have to average to a trend line, for example, that might miss some of the nuance and the richness and diversity that's happening in these experiences. And so that inspired Colleen and I think it was maybe a couple weeks before a deadline for a sea grant from our population center, thought, let's just do it. Let's try. Let's put in something for a qualitative study. And we got funding. And so we were able to conduct, we did seated interviews in people's homes if they had one, or their current place of residence, or a place nearby in the community, like a coffee shop, or a recreation center, or even a place of work if that was more comfortable for them. And we also did what we called a mobile interview. So we also asked them to show us sites that were important to them and that may have been affected by the Marshall Fire. And we were just probing for, broadly speaking, physical, mental, social health, intertwining experiences of how it impacted their economic lives and their daily lives. And so we were able to do this work over about a year and a half following the fire. We had 44 participants total. On average, they were about 52 years old. We did span from 18 all the way up to, I believe, into the 70s. The majority of folks partially reflecting the relatively affluent demographics of this area, but also how hard it can be to reach folks, for example, renters that have moved and we don't have ways to contact easily. So about 86% identified as white, 2/3 identified as female. The vast majority were homeowners, 86%, although 30% of them were still renting post-fire. They had not been able to get back into their homes for a variety of reasons. And we wanted to also compare folks who had a total loss, so their home completely burned down, and then those who were smoke damaged. Because Colleen, from what her connection to the community, she was hearing some really prolonged and sustained impact, in particular for smoke damaged households. They often call themselves the still standing. And so we really wanted to probe that difference. And so we made sure to have about half equal representation of a total loss household and smoke damaged. So that is kind of a key difference for some of these groups. And I was helping to train some of the graduate students to do interviews and to be in the field with this project. And I just had these, it was not a cognitive health study. It was on physical, mental, social health. But I can't help. Cognibility is always in my mind. I think about it probably way too often, including even on a race the other day. I was running through a neighborhood in Denver thinking, wow, that would score really well for cognibility. So it was in my brain. And I just, everything that they were saying was linked to dementia risk. And it just really resonated with me. So this is the updated kind of the Lancet Commission is a gold standard study, really a compilation of studies to think through. So we can now theoretically prevent or delay up to 45% of dementia cases worldwide. And you may notice there's 14 risk factors in this diagram, and a lot of them have really clustered now into midlife. So they used to have more in later life, where we have social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss, but we're really seeing quite a clustering of, I believe it's 10 out of the 14 risk factors are in midlife. So a really key and critical time period. And many of our participants were midlife. So we kind of had a good sample for us to start thinking through how, you know, experiencing a traumatic event like a fire could impact aspects like depression, physical activity, diabetes, and alcohol, for example. So that's how we kind of came to this research. And so we asked, how may exposure to the Marshall Fire affect or impact dementia risk? And I do want to just give a warning that some of these quotes are quite devastating. I will also try not to get emotional because I still picture the people saying these experiences. So it is really hard. So as I go through this, please just take care of yourselves if you need to, because this is quite sensitive material and it can be really hard at times, because we all have now, so many of us are connected to fires or to folks who've experienced disasters. So just a warning, please take care as we cover some of these quotes and material. So, to kind of set the scene, there were, of course, very overt kind of hazardous exposures that happened. And there were also really disrupted lives that happened from this experience. So, I'll just give the example of Hannah, who was working in childcare at the time. Hannah told us, this was the daycare building that she was working in. The building was completely smoke filled. Our grass around the playground was on fire. I locked all the kids and teachers in bathrooms, trying to block off any smoke that I could. By the time the last key was picked up, it was entirely black. You couldn't see in front of you at all. It was all ash and just burnt paper, and everything was swirling around the center like a tornado. We had to cover the kids' faces and kind of shove them out the door, as myself and the last teacher. We got out as everything around us was burning. And Hannah just went on to describe having a lot of physical symptoms. She had respiratory symptoms post fire, including chest tightness and coughing. And eventually it became to the point where her symptoms and mental health struggles were so strong that she couldn't work at this location anymore. And so it has impacted kind of some of her life trajectory since the day of the fire. Um, Also, many individuals whose homes were smoke damaged, they went home if they could, and as soon as they could, and they cleaned their homes. There was a lot of conflicting guidance at the time, and there was, at first, like county sent out guidance to clean your home, wipe up ash. You can see a photo of some ash in a windowsill. But there is not a lot of knowledge around smoke damage, in some ways, and just how invasive it is to every soft surface in your home. So if you're cleaning, you need to be wearing, full protective gear. You need to be using HEPA filters, for example. You can't just have a regular vacuum. That's going to cause more spray into the area. And there just was not a lot of knowledge about what to do. And so people who continue to live in these homes often perceive that they could, it literally gets into your inside your walls. It's in the insulation. It's in your HVAC system. So if you run the heating, if you run air conditioning, it is spewing out. And so this was really physically hard for many people. Again, this is their experiences. There are other robust quantitative studies that are measuring this inside people's homes. We're going to focus on their lived realities. And there was also a huge struggles with insurance. It's if you send a photo of your house completely burnt down. And I never want to compare trauma, of course, these are all devastating experiences. But if your house is burnt down, insurance doesn't fight you on getting, things replaced or rebuilt but when it's smoke damage, it may not look that bad. You can wipe up that ash in a windowsill and your window is not yet okay. It's often, depending on the level of damage, has to be fully replaced. But, many said insurance will not cover this. So that led to stress and fatigue and financial hardship, as well as continuing symptoms. So We have an example in the slides here from Jennifer, who mentioned her chronic headaches, difficulty breathing, chest pain, nausea, fog, fatigue, and bloody noses. This is just one of many examples from our smoke damaged households. We also heard about persistent grief and chronic persistent stress and chronic grief. This is a quote on the slide. It is just never over. Many people we interviewed, this was, 20 months post fire, 17 months, up to 2 years, and they still weren't in their homes yet. And they just felt like, as well, especially for smoke damage households, it felt like, to use the metaphor, kind of death by a thousand cuts. In the case of Maria and Santos, you don't realize at first, oh, we have to now, these books are making us sick. We have to throw them away. The blanket that my kid loves, I've got to throw away. My car, my laundry machine, it just keeps going. And it was really hard for them to even just have to, financial and insurance strains aside, just the exhaustion of having to make these choices over and over again for up to years. Anecdotally, we're still in contact with many folks and they're still making these decisions. And we're now, multiple years after the fire. So it was just really, really hard for them. There was just huge stress and anxiety. You can read from Pamela, who feels like she has this crushing pressure on her chest, and she feels like a rubber band ready to pop. And again, this is many, many months, well over a year and a half after the fire. I wish we could move on, but she was still navigating these challenges. Deborah felt like she'd been in a red zone, fight or flight state of panic for the past 17 months. And Amelia, in addition, was really navigating financial hardship. Quote, nobody ever said you could literally go bankrupt and lose everything you own because your house didn't burn to the ground. We also had a lot of trauma for parents. We didn't interview children, given ethical guidelines, but they mentioned their children really, really struggling. Also having, triggering events. One mentioned she couldn't reach her son, who was supposed to be at band practice, and she had a full-scale panic attack because she thought he wasn't okay. Oh, sorry, this is just so hard to share sometimes. Because you know them. And, there were also environmental triggers. Of course, windy days. Again, my kids didn't even live here for the fire, and they feel triggered on windy days. And so that's leading to disruptions in work, disruptions in school, and just really hard experiences for folks who are still living in this in a really daily way in some cases. It also affected sleep. There were intense sleep disruptions, of course, right after the fire, but there were also really chronic sleep impacts as well. So again, worrying about windy days, there were additionally 9 fires in Boulder County that followed that. They, of course, were thankfully under control, but you can see it. You can see that smoke billowing in the way that our geography is laid out in the Boulder County area. Some people are having to take sleep medications, and it's not just the mental toll. Of course, there is, sheer exhaustion, but it was also losing your bedroom, your pillow that you're just the right one, or that familiar sleep environment, or for some even essential equipment like their CPAP machines that they need. In the case of Stephanie, they had to move 10 times, and she just felt like it was really not able to kind of accommodate her body needs. But now to sheer exhaustion, we sleep, she shared. And in the case of Donna, she even mentioned some cognitive health symptoms from this sleep disruption where my memory is horrendous. I can't even bring up words sometimes. This also, of course, led to decreased physical activity, not having the time, not having the motivation when you're navigating all of this in your life, as well as sometimes not being able to access it as well. So, many folks mentioned that they were so tired, so mentally taxed, they didn't have time or energy to, get to a gym or even unable to go in. they didn't want to. I mean, Boulder's a wonderful place for outdoor recreation, but it was so physically hard to see sometimes, or it was, thankfully, it did snow right after the fire. So it did, bring a lot of the ash down and onto the ground, but people still found the landscape very traumatic afterwards. And so they didn't want to or feel comfortable, walking or biking or being in those spaces because of the fire. And just even having to relocate further across the area, so they weren't even close to sometimes their familiar places where they would exercise normally. Oh, there we go. And linked to this, of course, was also similarly not being able to eat as nutritiously given the time and the effort and the expense. And also for some, they did mention drinking more alcohol as a coping mechanism in this. So people didn't. They were. This is a photo. I used just a general news photo, not, so as not to betray the confidence of our participants, but there were families, in a single hotel room. That was all they could find, or they were trying to find rooms in places. So there wasn't room, or there wasn't full kitchens, or even any kitchens sometimes. So they weren't able to have family meals or be able to cook for themselves. Amanda shared that, they were displaced. And so between the meal planning and grocery shopping and the extra commuting they were doing because they were displaced for so long, they were in the car over 10 hours more a week. And so they were having to rely on, fast food or going to Costco and picking up pizzas because that's all they could manage at this time with everything going on. And again, there's a lot of quotes. I apologize on this slide. I know it's a lot of text. I didn't know which ones to pick because they're all just so striking. And I think of all these folks who I heard say these things. So they also mentioned, of course, using comfort foods as a coping mechanism. And so for some, they did perceive, again, this is their experiences. So we're doing other, robust quantitative studies, but some did share, for example, being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and thinking that this was in part doing, for example, in the case of Thomas, when he felt stressed during the past year and a half, he reaches for the sugar to boost my energy and my mood. Or in the case of Deborah, she does mention as well, drinking too much wine because every day was so hard. And in Michael's similar situation to having those comfort foods. And he also mentioned this often intertwined with loneliness. He felt like everyone else was moving on and he was still living that fire in a very daily way. And this led to discussions of kind of having increased loneliness and very fractured relationships. Many individuals just didn't have time to try to connect. They couldn't host family and friends anymore. They weren't able to get as often to their sites of connection and kind of informal care. In the case of Mark and Angela, they couldn't host, and many of their neighbors ended up leaving the neighborhoods. They felt like there was just this gap of what used to be there. And then for our smoke damaged households, they shared that there's kind of still a lack of understanding. They feel like that, well, how bad could it be? Your house didn't burn down. And so that lack of understanding can be really hard when you're navigating severe and longstanding trauma. So they found it hard to be in the community sometimes or talk to family or friends because, in the case of Maria, people stopped asking because no one wants to be traumatized. And there's this disbelief that things could have been that bad because when our house was not burnt down. I also want to recognize that there were positive experiences too. It was, I would say, largely negative, but for some, they were able to cope or even be quite resilient. I don't have much more time, so I will just share a couple examples. Excuse me. Some mentioned actually deepening kind of bonding and connecting with close friends or others who were impacted. In the case of Jennifer, she had other friends who experienced damage, and so they have this incredibly strong support group. She says 3 of her closest friends were also extreme smoke impacted. In the case of Andreas, soccer is a social outlet as well as a physical activity outlet. And so he actually signed up for more soccer, 3 or 4 soccer teams, so he could find a way to be with others, to move his body, and more importantly for him, quote, mentally get through it. So some folks were in the paper we're working on right now, diving into who had the ability to kind of be resilient in the face of these struggles. What were kind of the factors, both person and place based, that led to abilities to be resilient. And then for some as well, they mentioned resource and information sharing had really increased since the fire. So for Amanda, she became involved in several online and in-person groups and meetings. She started making birthday cakes for kids who lost their homes. And then people mentioned attending support groups. There were some free exercise classes and therapy, although those were relatively short term after the fire. And then also some did take advantage of in their displacement, trying to explore new areas to be outside and to move their bodies and to enjoy. So they did try to find silver linings where they could, given the circumstances they faced. So this is in progress. It's a draft. We need to improve it further, but it's kind of how we're thinking through the many behavioral pathways that lead to these dementia risk factors. So we have we heard people mention disrupted and educational experiences. We have a clustering of midlife experiences through, diet and exercise, for example, and mental health leading to these kind of midlife factors. And then, of course, isolation across all age groups, but in particular for our older adults. So, this is kind of a paper that we're currently working on and hoping to submit in the next month or two once we further kind of analyze these results. And so that's where the qualitative left us. And it really inspired us to want to try and test this out quantitatively. Can we see if some of these trends will hold to broader populations, to broader types of disasters? And so that's where our gears started to turn of, okay, what's next? How do we use this really rich, nuanced, very personal quality information to leverage into a larger scale project? And so Dr. Yue Sun will now take over to talk through how we are setting up. We're still very much in progress, but we're setting up a quantitative project to test some of these ideas nationally.
Thank you, Jessica. I will take it from here. For our quantitative project, we will investigate how extreme environmental events are linked to cognitive health among older adults. We firstly brainstormed the potential data sources. We decided to use health and retirement study to capture the cognitive health of older adults. And for environmental data, we considered a special hazards event and losses database. This is a county level database. This database covers 18 specific types of hazards such as flooding, heat wave, hurricane, ice storm, tsunami, and wildfire. And we also considered about famous National Risk Index. This database is at sense track level and covers the same specific hazard types as shared data. However, we didn't consider that for our study because it's rolling data. There is no specific definition of years, so it's difficult to say whether that data can represent a risk as of 2010 or 2015. And we also looked into wildfire smoke data because our qualitative research is about wildfire. And I will talk about this wildfire smoke data later. And we will also use National Neighborhood Data Archive for capturing social infrastructure availability of the census tract. The spatial coverage is the United States and the temporal coverage is from 1992 to 2022. Next slide. And we will investigate cognitive trajectory following exposure to an extreme environmental event, as well as relevant health behaviors that support brain health. Beyond the direct biological risk, extreme environmental events also disrupt daily routines and community networks to pose dementia risk through social and behavioral pathways. Moreover, the effect of extreme environmental events on cognitive health and related health behavior may vary by person and place-based characteristics such as income, race, ethnicity, rurality, and available social infrastructure set like library, community centers that provide support, connection, and informal care. Next slide. And then we applied for institutional ethnic board's approval. LB approval is necessary for applying HRS's restricted data. Next slide. And then we looked into HRS data. HRS is a longitudinal panel study and it's nationally representative covering Americans aged 50 and above. The core survey focuses on income, wealth, health and use of health service, employment, and family connection. Next slide. HRS has many data products. Some are publicly available, while others are restricted because they contain sensitive and confidential information. The public data include the core survey data, RAND HRS product, life history data resource, and some contributed data project like Gateway HRS products, and others are restricted, including cognition data, biomarker, and health data, restricted to the data of geographic information of the respondents and administrative linkage to Medicare and Social Security and genetic data. Next slide. And HRS actually itself include one measures about the disaster exposure is a retrospective measure of life course exposure to natural disasters. This survey question was asked in the Leave Behind psychosocial questionnaire in the core survey during 2006 to 2012. And the survey question is, quote, have you ever been in a major fire, flood, earthquake, or other natural disaster, quote. About 20% of observation answered yes for this question. And it also has a follow-up question about what year, the year of disaster exposure. About 3,500 observation reported the year and ranging from 1902 to 2019. Next slide. And because we will need to use HRS restricted data, including cross with geographic information at county and sense tract level for linking the cognitive health measure and our disaster exposure measures from the shared data. And we will need this geographic information for making this linkage. And we also need the decennial census and American Community Survey data for the county and census tract level covariance of social demographic composition. And we also need access to National Neighborhood Data Archive for capturing social infrastructure of the census tract. Because it contains sensitive and confidential information, they are available only under the restricted data agreement. To apply for RDA, we provided project title and research abstract, and we also provided HRS restricted data products and variables we will use for research. And we expand why public health are not adequate for our research and how the result we plan to export will comply with the requirement of disclosure limitation review. We also provided a brief description of the external data, and we also provided LB approval. It's necessary for access the HRS restricted data. We also completed the MICDA access agreement, namely the HRS enclave. We need to use all the restricted data within the HRS enclave. The agreement must be signed by the principal investigator and all members of the project team. After all team member signature has been obtained, the MICDA access agreement must be signed by an access agency representative. If the project includes a team member for more than one institution, an agreement must be submitted for each institution. Next slide. And the team members who require access to data will be asked to create an account and submit a data security plan and a CV in PDF format. HRS staff will review and request revision of data application. Next slide. Then we looked into the disaster data, like shared data. We appreciate Cache for facilitating the connection with shared team, and we had a chance to contact with Dr. Melanie Gale at Arizona State University to learn this data set. And this data is available during from January 1960 to December 2023. It's annually updated database, and it covers all states and counties in the U.S. This database covers 18 specific hazard types, and they have a specific measure of the severity of disasters, including count of people killed, count of people injured, and damage to property and crops. And you can sign up on the Shadow website and query the data. You can either aggregate or specify by month, year, and hazard type, and county or state level. And you can test a state first, such as South Carolina. The data of South Carolina, like in the cache, is free, publicly free. And then if you query for other state, you might need to pay for the invoice. Next slide. And for the wildfire smoke data, we looked into the time series of potential U.S. wildfire smoke exposure data. And it captures daily wildland fire smoke exposure at the sense track level from 2010 to 2019 in the U.S. It combines data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office of Satellite and Product Operations, has mapping systems smoke product with U.S. Census Block group population centers to estimate potential exposure to light, medium, and heavy category of wildfire smoke. And the next slide. Now we are working on importing the external data into the HRS MICDA to join with the HRS data. We are navigating the data use agreement because HRS requires you need to make the data available to other HRS restricted data user. After publishing the result, well, shared data is license based. So we are trying to navigating this difference in the data use agreement right now. And the next slide. After we figure out the data use agreement issue, we will run the analysis. We will use Latin growth curve model. Here is a hypothesis figure, and the vertical gray dashed line represents the timing of the disaster, and the darker gray line represents the old adult who never experienced the disaster, and their cognitive health will decline slowly over time, and the red represents the old adult with exposure to disaster. And we hypothesize that after the disaster, their cognitive health will decline rapidly, over time. The blue line represents the old adult with disaster exposure, but also good access to social infrastructure. We hypothesize that good access to social infrastructure can mitigate the adverse effect of natural disaster on cognitive health. Thus, the blue line is relatively flat than the red line. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, QA. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more to share as we navigate the trickiness of joining data sets and navigating. HRS is an amazing resource, but it is quite challenging to work with at times. There's a lot of bureaucratic processes that is such a just massive and intense project overall, but well worth the effort, I think, if you're able to have time. So, and I just want to plug an upcoming CASH event. We're actually going to have a longer discussion and workshop and panel on integrating data with environmental data with the HRS and linking it to contextual data. So please join us if you're able to. I think these are going to be wonderful events, and we have some folks joining who are the people at HRS who literally are behind the scenes making these data come together and be available. So I think it'll be super, super useful if you're interested. And I believe we'll also record and share that afterwards too, if folks are not able to join on a weekend, I think. And just to wrap up, a quick thank you. We're so grateful to the participants who just really generously shared their time. They welcomed us into their homes. We've had some amazing graduate students who are integrally involved in this work, and both CASH, seed grants, the cognitability work, and NANDA have all received funding from National Institutes on Health. So thank you to our funders for making this work possible. And I'll just leave you with a quote that someone wrote on their now rebuilt home. It says, "Victory, you have prevailed, and this home will be a sanctuary." So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to present to you all today.
Thank you, Jessica and Yue. That was fantastic. And Jessica, what a powerful closing quote too. You got me all weepy as well. So thank you, and thank you for the warning too. It's tough stuff to think about. Any questions from the group? We have a few in the chat, but if anybody has something they'd like to start with. We did put a few resources in the chat as well that CASH provides in terms of access to the pulse data that Deborah mentioned in a comment. There's also some code that links the Shieldus data to the ACS. So Jessica, I could ask, I posted a question about rural spaces, and I guess it it can link to both the qual and the quant. So many dimensions of that fabulous graphic of cognability are really of primary relevance to urban spaces, traffic, various storefronts and things. So I wondered about cognability as a concept and its applicability in rural America. And UA, the same sort of thing in terms of using the HRS. Are you going to be able to get to some of the urban and rural differences in terms of these connections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have separate projects, both ongoing and planned, to kind of tackle cognability in rural communities. For example, neighborhoods is not a concept that typically applies to rural areas. And so that's kind of a separate and distinct work. So when I showed, I didn't give all the plots behind that one infographic, but yes, we did clip the study down to urban, suburban dwelling folks, and we have separate analyses to focus on rural. So we have some different types of social infrastructure that seem to be significant in rural compared to urban. Of course, these kind of classic density and walkability measures are not going to operate in that way in rural. So that is a definite separate line of work. I think where you live, whether it's urban or rural, it absolutely impacts your cognitive health through biological, social, and behavioral pathways. But the specific kind of environmental features that matter do differ. And we are seeing some differences. And I know UA is actually doing a rural focused project. So UA, I'll pass it over to you to elaborate on the quantitative side.
Yes, I'm recently doing a cognitive project in the rural found some interesting findings bar is good for cognitive health, like in rural, but not in urban, like because bar is a good place, like for a rural person, like to social, like there's across the rural and the urban area, residents like their social behaviors are very different. So we will further test like other social infrastructure and the third place site, like to see the difference.
Wow, bars are good for health. That's interesting. No, thank you. I think that's, I mean, very different mechanisms. So very interesting. Thank you. Any other questions? I did about, I'll ask one more if that's okay. The IRB and the ethical dimensions of doing this kind of qualitative work. I know that's something you've thought deeply about, but I think it's good for everyone to consider.
Yeah, qualitative work is an emotional burden that you take on, if you're doing it right, I think. The ethics itself, like the IRB application, is not necessarily all that more extensive. It actually sometimes surprises me in some ways that our IRBs aren't more in depth for when, especially when we're covering a topic that we know is trauma filled for folks. So in some ways, the IRB was no different than my other qualitative studies on just neighborhoods and health, or COVID study. But um, we worked very hard when in the field to be very attentive to both our participants and ourselves. One of our RAs, he lived right on the edge of the fire, and so was someone who was impacted by this as well. So, and he had, for example, he did such an amazing job connecting with participants, making them feel heard and trusted, that some of them would call him sometimes afterwards, including in a moment of crisis. And so we had a system in place. I tried to help as best I could to prepare him for this because he was our main contact. But it's still, when someone calls you in a crisis, we are not trained social workers or psychologists. We are researchers. We refer to proper services and professional counseling. We carry resources. We try to be, empathetic, engaged listeners, but there's limits as researchers to what we can do. And we also, everyone's different, but we cried with our participants. Sometimes we brought tissues. We connected with them. I'm a parent, obviously. As you can tell, I'm sick from my kids right now. So we engaged on many levels with them, and as appropriate, you can share, those connections with them. You have to understand, again, what you are still the researcher and interviewer, so it's not your place to, make it about you in any way, but it can sometimes be points of connection that make them feel validated and heard in sharing this. We also tried to be thoughtful about places. So oftentimes people would meet at a home if they had one to host us at. But for some, they were choosing quite busy community coffee shops. So we would usually go early and try and scout out like a corner table, or there was a few that were tucked away in some of the like kind of alcoves. And so we would make sure also to put them with their back to the public area so that they could have a little more privacy and make sure no one could overhear. So we really tried to, we're actually writing a separate paper on taking care of yourself and your participants during field work, and it's based on actually 3 studies that have all challenged, navigated difficult topics. And so we are doing separate work on that just to think through how to really take care of yourself, how to build in little things like after an interview, write your notes as detailed as you can, and then take a break, go for a walk, go see friends, your kids, family, whoever, whatever it is, whatever makes you feel like little things like that, building in time for self-care, not overscheduling. At one point we had 8 or 9 interviews in 1 week, and it was way too much. We were just run ragged, and it was taking a toll on the quality of our notes, our questioning. These are intense moments. So I have so many thoughts about this. If anyone ever wants to talk qual research, and hopefully we'll have a paper that is purely focused on these aspects. It is hard work, but it is so rewarding, and so needed to help bring people and stories and new ideas and hypotheses to especially our kind of more classic demographic work that we do.
Thank you, Jessica. So powerful, and thanks for being so thoughtful. And I think that paper will be an amazing resource. Deborah.
Well, thanks, Lori. Thanks, Jessica and Yue, for this really, really interesting work. I would encourage you. I stuck a comment in the chat about the pulse data, and I guess not that I think there's an opportunity for you to compare in the old pulse, not the new high tops version, which is a panel, but in the old pulse there is a state is clearly that's the geography of that's the final geography, and it asks, there's a question: in the last year, have you been displaced from a natural disaster? And it indicates which natural disasters, like people identify. And it's a rapid turnaround survey, so it's like a game changer, I think, in our national statistical infrastructure that helps to add to the canon of the longitudinal data sets. And that pulse data set has moved from a cross section to a panel, a longitudinal panel, but the old data sets might align with the timing of the Marshall Fire. And they do ask, if people report being displaced, they ask many additional questions on hardship. There also are separate questions about like anxiety and depression and other forms of mental health outcomes in the pulse data set. So I think it might be an interesting, there are very few people who have the kind of like in-depth knowledge that you have to just sort of try to pair from the very qualitative piece and understanding a single community to what this might mean in a national infrastructure. And if you can reflect on that also, like it might be really obvious to you what 2 or 3 questions they could have asked instead that would have been much better. And, you know, these are experimental, quote unquote, experimental, fairly new data products. So there would be an opportunity to put, you know, in the Federal Register, put in a comment saying, consider this question. And those questions do change. So anyhow, I see it as also an opportunity, but also some interesting analysis. I mean, I think it's a really good step in the right direction that there are these that the federal government is using some of its resources to try to get at disaster response. But anyhow, I just put that there in case it's like an opportunity for you to compare with it. It's like it's on the other side of the spectrum of the very careful, qualitative, in-depth work that you've done, but I wouldn't be surprised. I bet there are some themes that come through in both, and that would be really helpful to the community at large to understand where they align and where they differ and complement one another.
Thank you, Deborah. That's great. Quick thought, Jessica?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm still new. I mean, at this world, as of 3 years ago, I never thought about disasters in any kind of in-depth research way. So I know vaguely about it. So it's really helpful, Deborah. And yeah, I think for what we could add to our surveys, sometimes we're very focused on objectively measure kind of biological health outcomes, and they're absolutely important, and we should track diabetes or cancer or but asking these behavioral impacts that we know trickle into and bundle up towards like long-term health outcomes, I think that is one aspect. I also want to get more life course specific. I think if something happens to you in a certain life course stages, I think it can make a difference as to the impacts in your life afterwards. There's so many variables that could go into that. I will stop talking for sake of time, but thank you, and I'll follow up with you further.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. There's a lot of resources listed in the chat as well in terms of what you can access for the center. And a big thanks to Doctors Finley and Sand. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thanks, folks. Take care.